Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Chats on the Past program, where the museum discusses history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. My name, as always, is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Director of Programs and Education for the Westport Museum for History and Culture. At the museum, we are pleased to offer our free programming as we are tonight. And we do have a suggested donation of $5 for all of our programming to continue all of our events. We do understand this is still a very difficult time, especially with the holidays coming, and we ask that you support the museum however you are able. One of those ways is following and liking us on all of our social media platforms. If you've been enjoying our programming and would like to be notified, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Westport History and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. The recordings of all of our free programs are also on our Facebook pages and on our YouTube channel, which you can find just by searching the museum's name. During our program, if you have any questions, comments, or anecdotes that you would like to share, please enter them in the chat box, and I will go through as many of those comments and questions as I can at the end of our presentation. Tonight, we are joined by Jane Ziegelman, who is the author of the James Beard Award-winning A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression, which she co-wrote with her husband, Andrew Coe. She is also author of the best-selling 97 Orchard, an edible history of 5 immigrant families in one New York tenement. Jane is a longtime collaborator with the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and she lives in Brooklyn. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Jane.
Well, thank you so much for the invite. I really
Of course. I'm going to turn it over to Jane now, who has a wonderful presentation about a square meal. She's going to tell us a little bit more about the project.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. So I have a presentation and I'm just going to launch right into it. I just have to press a couple of buttons on my computer. There and there. Okay, we're up, Nicole? Yeah.
We are all set to go.
Okay, good. And whoops. Oh my dear. I'm sorry. Andy, I need technical advice from my husband. Can you come here, please? It's not advancing when I press the button.
I don't know what you're doing. Okay.
Okay, thank you. October 29, 1929, the day the stock market crashed, is what we think of as the start of the Great Depression. For the people who lived through it, however, the crash appeared as an aberration, a temporary setback. For a couple of days, it made the headlines. It was on the front pages. But if you look back at old newspapers, you'll see that it didn't stay there. And here's what those headlines may have looked like. Yes, it was understood that the markets were jittery and a growing number of Americans were out of work, but the politicians, and this includes most importantly our President Hoover, insisted that the US was experiencing a normal cyclical downturn and that a recovery was imminent. And the headline that you're looking at right now comes from May of 1930. So he he was wrong. In American cities like New York, things did not seem normal at all. One of the first signs that something was wrong were attendance patterns in the public schools. In the winter of 1930, teachers began to notice that more kids than usual were missing school, and for longer periods than in normal years. As always, if a child was absent for more than 3 days, truant officers were sent to the home to check on their whereabouts. But instead of truants, what they found were children that were too malnourished to leave the house. This was entirely shocking. Malnutrition was not an American problem. It was something you found in other countries. America was the world's breadbasket. It's where people came to be fed. One of Hoover's mantras at the time, his way of reassuring the American public, was to say that, well, no one has starved. But it soon became apparent that that was not true. And as it turns out, one of the very early, more public victims of starvation was a Connecticut man. He was from Norwalk, and he was a war hero who died of starvation because he was too proud to ask for help. By 1931, America was in the throes of a hunger epidemic, and there was no system in place to address it. Remember, this was before any kind of federal welfare, before Social Security and food stamps. So what do you do? Well, in cities across America, people cobbled together an improvised network of food assistance programs. The most visible of them all were the Breadlines. Breadlines, you should know, were not a new invention. Some of America's first breadlines were established in the 19th century. They were down on the Bowery, and they catered to vagrants, many of them alcoholics. As the name implies, they served bread and coffee to these marginal figures, and there was a tremendous stigma attached to them. By the winter of 1930-31, breadlines were popping up all over America, no longer just for alcoholics or vagrants. The new breadlines fed a diverse crowd that included both working people, and many of these were people who had never asked for charity before, all the way up to white-collar professionals. What we have here is an image of a Breadline Kitchen. This one happens to be from New York, from a municipal, a city-funded facility that was attached to a homeless shelter. And I like this picture because it gives you a sense of the scale of the kind of feeding that was taking place. Those are really large vats. I think they're 30-gallon vats filled with soups and stews and foods like that. And this next image, again, you see our patrons, and you get a sense of the kind of improvised nature of the Breadline dining facilities. You can see how the tables are just planks balanced on these sawhorses. And another detail that is, I think, very evocative is if you look at the plates, everyone used tin plates. That was sort of a standard of the Breadlines. So the question now is, well, what were they eating? Well, the Breadline diet was based around three staples. The three pillars were bread, beef, and coffee. So a typical menu alternated between beef and mutton stew, franks and beans, and on Fridays, there was usually some kind of fish dish, most often something like clam chowder. These were meals designed to stave off hunger. They were never meant as a long-term solution. And this next image is a man eating a turkey wing, because on Thanksgiving and on Christmas, they did serve a kind of holiday meal, usually of turkey. And I think it's a photo that really gives you a sense of the visceralness of the hunger. Now, one thing you won't see on Breadlines, and I'm just going to go back to this group photo, is women. Breadline customers were almost exclusively men, not as a matter of policy, but of historical precedent. For a respectable woman to stand on a breadline, this very traditionally male institution, was to put her good character in question. So separate, more feminine facilities were created. They were, in this case, we see a woman's canteen that were exclusively for females. And you'll notice here that there are curtains in the window to protect the women from the gaze of strangers. As the number of breadlines multiplied, opinion in this country was divided over whether they were helping or hurting. Yes, they were feeding the hungry, but weren't they also demoralizing? Didn't they encourage dependency? The idea that you didn't have to work to eat. Weren't they antithetical, in fact, to the American work ethic? Well, these were arguments that percolated all through the Depression and which helped shape attempts at feeding hungry Americans. In the fall of 1930, New York was one of the first cities to initiate an innovative mass feeding program that turned police stations into food distribution centers. To solve the problem of what to feed its citizens, the city turned to nutritionists, these were women trained in home economics, to come up with an emergency diet that would supply essential calories and nutrients. Their recommendations were passed on to the Department of Markets, which was put in charge of buying the food, while the Department of Sanitation was put in charge of transporting it. Policemen, who were the foot soldiers in this whole citywide operation, were given the job of boxing up the food and handing it out to needy families. And this next image, okay, we have the policemen handing out the boxes. And this image is the list of contents, what were in those boxes. You'll see these are really sort of the basic foods, providing calories and a sort of minimal amount of micronutrients, of vitamins and minerals. It's an austere diet. You'll notice there's no meat, there's no fresh vegetables, there's no fresh fruit, fresh eggs, or fresh dairy. Also noteworthy are the directions that came with these boxes. And if you just sort of look down to the bottom of this box, you'll see some cooking suggestions. And I'm just going to read out beans. Well, serve them plain or cooked with onion and tomatoes. Macaroni, plain or cooked with onions and tomatoes. Cabbage, carrots, and onions, raw, sliced, or boiled. Turnips, plain or cooked or mashed with potatoes. So there was no attention really to the experience of eating. It was just to get these nutrients into the body. As the Depression deepened, home economists across the country launched into action. Their central command, so to speak, was a federal agency in Washington, D.C., called the Bureau of Home Economics, which was a branch of the Department of Agriculture and the country's single largest employer of women scientists. The Bureau was founded in 1923 as a kind of homemaking research center focused on cooking, cleaning, and sewing. But during the Depression, the Bureau put its regular work on hold to focus on feeding America. As malnutrition spread, the Bureau recognized a unique teaching opportunity and launched a national educational campaign. As part of it, they issued a series of dietary guides that told people what to eat, but which also functioned as basic nutritional textbooks or primers. Nutrition in the 1930s was an emotionally fraught subject. Dietary guides came with warnings that poor food habits in childhood could handicap a person for life. Vitamins were especially concerning, and more than anything else, women were afraid of what was called the hidden hunger. This is the hunger caused by vitamin and mineral deficiencies, which you don't feel, but which meanwhile are causing all kinds of nutrition-related diseases like rickets and pellagra. Reassurance from the Bureau came in the form of a fictional radio character named Aunt Sammy. Aunt Sammy was a kind of American everywoman. She came on the radio once a day over hundreds of stations across America. And an important part of Aunt Sammy's mission was to get women to cook with these, what were called or thought of as low budget, low status foods, like beans and liver. These were foods that people didn't necessarily want to eat, but which Aunt Sammy championed. And for each of these ingredients, she supplied recipes, which were then sent out as pamphlets, and then were compiled into a best-selling cookbook, bringing nutritional science into millions of American homes. So again, like those recipes that were given out by the New York City Department of Markets, Aunt Sammy endorsed a kind of cooking that was very much in the plain and simple tradition. And the sort of the questions that I would like to leave you with is why this emphasis on plainness? Was it purely economic, or were there other factors at play? And I'd like to just make a couple of suggestions for you to think about. Number one is that the American palate was different in the 1930s. Food preferences were different. As a rule, Americans valued subtle, delicate flavors. These were foods cooked in cream sauce, for example, or salads dressed in mayonnaise. And unless you belong to one of our immigrant communities, the chances are you refrain from using foods like garlic or peppers. These were sort of pungent, full-flavored ingredients. Plain food was thought of as more wholesome than what was called highly seasoned foods. And all through the Depression, something else to think about, which is very important, is the idea of food and enjoyment. It was considered fundamentally un-American in these, for instance, in the food boxes, to give out foods that enhanced our pleasure of eating. The people who ran these food programs didn't want recipients to see food handouts as any kind of reward. Food was not intended to be enjoyed, but simply to provide nourishment. And while our thinking has evolved in this area, I'd argue that you can still see interesting strains of all these ideas in contemporary food culture. And with that, I'm going to open my screen and open questions to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Jane. That was wonderful. And those images are fantastic.
Great.
Before we jump into questions directly related to a square meal, we do have just a couple of really quick questions about you, Jane. And how did you become interested in writing? And specifically, how did you become interested in this topic, which you co-wrote with your husband, Andrew?
Right. Well, I can tell you that I was always a kid who thought I would be a writer. I thought I would be a great novelist, and I wrote stories and I bound them, and I was very proud of them. And this is really who I thought I was going to be, was this American fiction writer. Well, it turns out that fiction is really, really difficult and takes, I think, a really particular mind, and I do not have that mind. I was always really interested in literature, and my first work when I got out of school was in publishing, so I became a sort of behind the scenes person. And I did sort of different kinds of work before I realized that I was going to be able to sort of write a book myself. And my first book, it was about immigrants in New York, and it was written through my connection with the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. It was about food history on the Lower East Side and immigrant food culture. And in a lot of ways, it kind of paved the way for this book because it was so much about food and resourcefulness, food in extremis, food in poverty. That became something of enormous interest to me. And in a sense, this project grew out of my first book. So that's sort of how I would explain it.
It's fascinating, and it's interesting that your first book led into your second book. So many of our authors tell us that it is a progression between projects, and that so much of that history overlaps and kind of grows into another history.
Yeah, I would say that was very much the case to me.
I would also tell our audience that I cannot recommend the Tenement Museum enough. I have been, and they have wonderful tours. They have a wonderful museum there. So I'm very pleased to hear about your work with them. They're
It's a wonderful place. I also recommend it very highly.
So can you tell our audience a little bit more about the resources and the primary resources that you and Co used in crafting this book? And it sounds like some of those resources may have come from 97 Orchard as well.
Yes, well, like many writers of history, our objective was to use as many primary sources as we could and to rely less on secondary resources or sources. So what do I mean by primary resources? These are documents that were produced during the period we were studying by actors who were important to that period. That included all kinds of government documents produced by both federal and municipal government agencies. So rather dry reading, but if you can pull out the interesting details, they tell a really interesting story. It included a lot of newspaper work, and most importantly, we looked at what were called the women's section or the women's pages of both large city and small town newspapers. So it's where people talked about food. And as it turns out, the Bureau of Home Economics planted stories on these pages. So they were a very important, the women's pages became a very important mouthpiece for the Bureau of Home Economics, second only to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the Bureau's most important champion and who wrote a book, and I'm just now trying to remember the title. It was a book about food in the Depression. I think it was called It's Up to the Women. So that was another kind of resource. Books written by primary actors who were important during the period. They could be political figures, or cookbooks were important. We used a number of archives, including the National Archive, which has one branch outside of DC and another branch in Kansas City. We looked at the Presidential Library, Roosevelt's Presidential Library in Hyde Park, and of course, the good old New York Public Library always has important resources. So I would say those are really important sort of go-to places for documents.
It's interesting that you mentioned these kind of placed accounts in the newspapers from some of these agencies. It makes you think of almost this fake news that comes out today, that these false reports were put in, but for the ultimate goal of feeding people and putting forth this message. That's an interesting idea on their part.
Yeah, there's one thing I should mention that I didn't put in my original list, again, in the same vein of placing news with the public, are pamphlets. You cannot imagine how important pamphlets were in a pre-TV society, and of course a pre-computer internet society, as a way of conveying information to the public. pamphlets were all over the place. And they were produced by the millions by these various government agencies, like the Bureau of Home Economics. So there was a lot of pamphlet and poster reading, somewhat like the poster that we saw in the presentation, the Eat These Food posters. They were enormously important as a way of, as a form of educating the public, as a way to educate the public about food and nutrition.
And I'm sure that was much more economic at the time, but were there radio broadcasts in this same vein that you were able to access?
Well, Sammy was on the radio. So she was, I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt also did radio broadcasts. Public radio was very important. So for instance, when those food boxes were being distributed, there were recipes given over the air to coordinate with the food distributions. So yes, radio, newspaper, pamphlets, posters. These were really the important channels of information.
Those are such valuable sources as well.
Yes.
There was one piece that I did want to share with everyone tonight. I am also going to share my screen here for just a second. In the museum's collection, we actually hold a piece, if you can see this here. This is a New Year's or Christmas card from a local Westporter during the Great Depression. This is from 1932, and it's a very kind of humorous take on what they called the flops and depression of 1932. This is one of the items that we hold in our collection related to the Depression, and it's one of those things that we can look at to get an idea of how people were handling this situation, at least in Westport. And this was kind of refreshingly a humorous take on the holidays of 1932. And a really lovely resource on our end that we like to show during the holidays.
You know what
Something you might have
think
received.
of, Nicole, is our situation in the days of COVID, and how, if you're really clever and you do it the right way, you can find humor in a pandemic. And I'm thinking in particular of a New Yorker cover that shows a woman who's obviously in the throes of quarantine, and there are masks on the floor and hand disinfectant on her table. And there's a bag of Cheetos on the floor. She's doing, pandemic eating. But it's a very sort of gently humorous look at our interior lives during a pandemic. So there's a lot of crossover, I think, between what people were suffering during the Depression and what we're feeling right now.
I agree, especially now as we see this kind of economic downturn that we're seeing at the moment. There's definitely a lot of reflection to be done at this time. And I do hope that that everyone out there is safe and is hopefully finding a little bit of that humor through the holidays this year. Another question I wanted to ask Jane was, a lot of the book focuses on the shift in thinking about food, and you touched on this in your presentation about the way that the boxes were put together and how it was much more of a way to fulfill a calorie goal. Can you talk a little bit more about this shift in thinking?
Well, it's a shift that really begins at the turn of the 20th century with the birth of nutrition, the discovery of things like calories, and then the eventual discovery in the teens and 20s of these micronutrients, of minerals and vitamins. I would say that in this country, we've always had a kind of uneasiness about enjoying our food. It's maybe our Puritan roots. And to look at food through the way of science was another way of approaching eating that took away the idea of sensory satisfaction. So it was something that we sort of took to very naturally as Americans. Of course, I'm not saying that there isn't value, tremendous value in nutritional science. So I'm not to negate that value, but I think there are complex factors at work in our attachment to science as a kind of lens through which to view our food intake. And just to sort of give you a modern day example, and this is something that I don't think you see in other food cultures, are things like food supplements, like powdered things that you mix in drinks and then sort of slug down in the morning, not because they provide sensory satisfaction, but because they give us high protein to give us the muscles or the workouts that we need. That's a kind of modern day extension of this way of thinking. I think it really becomes very important during the Depression, and it's when it really sort of goes mainstream. And in many ways, we're still living in that world. Although again, we're evolving. Food culture is ever evolving. Though I see vestiges of it sort of all around us.
And related to this shift in kind of science, in relation to this thinking about food very scientifically in a nutritional way, is this when we see legislation and regulation start to come into play with nutritional facts and ingredient lists? Is it during this time, or is it just after the Depression that we see
just
some
around
of that?
now? It's toward the end of the Depression that you begin to see things like nutritional breakdown on food labels. I mean, this is sort of the following chapter is World War II, and how nutrition became an important idea in feeding our soldiers. And we wanted to have the nutritionally we wanted the strongest fighting men. So it took on a new importance in that context. But yes, it's very much the beginning of that kind of government involvement in dictating what and how Americans eat.
The final question that I have for you, Jane, before we come over to our audience questions is, what is one thing that you would like everyone who reads A Square Meal to come away with? Is there one lesson or one goal or one thing that you would like them to really take from the book?
I can tell you that the part of the story which fascinated me the most were these women at the Bureau of Home Economics, and how important, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, it's up to the women, how important women were in forming our food policies and in leading the country sort of out of malnutrition. And these women, I should add, could not get jobs outside of food science. Food was sort of considered a acceptable female realm of expertise. But as it turns out, it became this immensely important area of for women scientists. So that's sort of I was always very admiring of these women and of their work. So I would say, look at the Bureau of Home Economics. It's a really interesting chapter in our history.
Thank you, Jane. We do have a couple of audience questions. If you have any other questions, please do enter them in the Q&A or chat box. But we do have a couple of them here. And the first one is, have you made any of the recipes? Have you
Yes.
tried
Yeah.
any?
Yeah, I absolutely have. And what can I say about them? Well, I mean, here, just to give you an idea of some of the recipes that Aunt Sammy suggested, there was one dish where you parboil onions, hollow them out, and fill them with peanut butter, and then bake them. So, I mean, this sort of makes sense if you do the nutritional calculus. There's protein from the peanut butter, the vitamins provide a certain number of vitamin nutrients. But I can tell you that the finished dish aesthetically does not make any sense at all. So this is what happens if you just look at the science and you don't sort of factor in other important parts of cooking, which is taste. Now, something that I do really like from this period are the nut loaves. Loaves were a very important Depression era recipe. So these were ingredients that used either legumes like beans and peas, lima beans and kidney beans, or nuts, or a mixture of nuts and beans. And you sort of make them into a meatloaf, minus the meat. So they're bound with eggs and breadcrumbs, and then you bake them in a loaf pan. And I really like nut loaves. So that was one Depression era, very important Depression era dish that I enjoyed. It kind of reminds me a little bit of 1960s, 1970s hippie vegetarian cooking. And I got a kick. I like nut loaves. Something I desperately dislike are Jello salads, particularly when they have things like canned ham in them. So there's a lot from that era, which I'm quite glad we've left behind. But I do think that there were some interesting dishes that are worth revisiting.
And is there a place that anyone can find these recipes if they would like to try and make a nut loaf?
Yeah. I mean, if you have access to old newspapers, they were all over the newspapers. If you can get your hands on an Aunt Sammy cookbook, you'll find them in Aunt Sammy. And I think a lot of that material is digitized. Um, it's out there. I can't think of a really quick way to get to it, but yes, if you put just nut loaf in as a search, I'm sure that you will be able to come up with some good nut loaf
Yeah.
recipes.
Well, I'll have to do some searching and see if we can find a good nut loaf recipe.
Yeah, I recommend it.
We have another question here. Thinking about Aunt Sammy, would you consider her the female version of Uncle Sam, promoting patriotism as a way to encourage Americans to embrace the message?
Absolutely. She was very much thought of as a kind of consort to Uncle Sam. Not quite a romantic partner, but a kind of female equivalent. And yes, very much in a patriotic mode. I think that's a really good call. She was not just a dispenser of cooking advice, but a kind of beacon of, American, we can do it sort of attitude, a real, we can get through it together kind of gal.
And the last question that I have this evening from our audience is there a specific woman who you wish people knew more about from this group of the economics standpoint?
There's one woman that comes to mind who led the Bureau of Home Economics, whose name is Louise Stanley, who was a really, she was a brilliant chemist. She studied at Columbia. She had her PhD from Columbia and was really quite an accomplished scientist who was instrumental in leading the Bureau through this very difficult period. She's the kind of woman that I think deserves to be known. So yeah, I would point to Louise Stanley.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. Everyone, to get a copy of A Square Meal, we encourage you to visit bookshop.org to support local independent booksellers. Thank you again, Jane, for telling us more about this fascinating topic.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
And thank you to our audience. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful holiday and enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much.
Bye, Nicole.